Baal, the storm god of fertility and power. Baal appears more frequently in the Bible than any other false god, mentioned over 90 times across the Old Testament. The name Baal means Lord or Master, and referred to various local deities throughout the ancient Near East, but primarily represented the Canaanite storm god who controlled rain, fertility, and agricultural prosperity. Baal worship involved elaborate rituals on high places called bamot, where priests would dance frantically, cut themselves with knives until blood flowed, and cry out for hours trying to get Baal's attention. The famous confrontation between Elijah and 450 prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel in 1 Kings 18 demonstrates these desperate practices, as the prophets slashed themselves and shouted from morning until evening without any response. The sexual aspects of Baal worship were particularly abhorrent to God, involving ritual prostitution with both male and female temple prostitutes called Kedushim and Kedushat. Worshippers believed that engaging in sexual acts at Baal's temples would ensure fertility for their crops, livestock, and families. These practices directly violated God's commands about sexual purity and exclusive worship. Baal was often depicted as a warrior holding a thunderbolt and a mace, standing on a bull that represented strength and fertility. Archaeological discoveries have revealed numerous Baal figurines and altars throughout Israel and surrounding regions, showing how pervasive this worship became among God's people. The attraction to Baal worship stemmed from the Israelites' desire to ensure agricultural success in their new land, leading them to adopt the religious practices of their Canaanite neighbors. Molech, the child sacrificing fire. God Molech represents one of the most horrific false gods mentioned in the Bible, demanding child sacrifice through fire as the primary form of worship. The name Molech comes from the Hebrew melech, meaning king, and this Ammonite deity was worshipped by passing children through fire or burning them alive as offerings to ensure prosperity and divine favor. The worship of Molech took place in the Valley of Hinnom outside Jerusalem, where parents would heat a bronze statue of the god until it glowed red hot, then place their living children in its outstretched arms. The screams of the burning children were drowned out by loud drumming and music, creating a horrific scene that God repeatedly condemned throughout Scripture. Leviticus 22-5 prescribes the death penalty for anyone who sacrifices children to Molech, stating that God himself will set his face against such people and cut them off from their community. Despite these clear prohibitions, several Israelite kings participated in Molech worship, including Ahaz and Manasseh, who sacrificed their own sons in the fire according to 2 Kings 16:3 and 21:6. The archaeological site of Carthage has revealed thousands of urns containing the cremated remains of infants and young children, confirming the historical reality of child sacrifice to Molech and related deities. These discoveries validate the biblical accounts and demonstrate why God commanded the complete destruction of nations that practiced such abominations. Asherah, the fertility goddess, and her sacred poles. Asherah was the Canaanite mother goddess associated with fertility, sexuality, and the sea, often referred to as the consort of Baal or the chief god El. The Bible mentions Asherah over 40 times, usually in connection with wooden poles or groves that were erected as symbols of her presence and power over fertility and reproduction. These Asherah poles were carved wooden images or living trees that served as focal points for fertility rituals involving sexual acts performed to ensure agricultural and human fertility. Worshippers believed that engaging in sexual intercourse near or around these poles would transfer the goddess's reproductive power to their crops, animals, and families. The worship of Asherah was particularly appealing to women who desired children or feared infertility, leading many Israelite women to participate in these rituals despite God's prohibitions. Archaeological evidence shows that Asherah figurines were common household items throughout ancient Israel, indicating widespread private worship alongside public ceremonies. King Josiah's reforms included cutting down and burning all the Asherah poles throughout Judah, as recorded in 2 Kings 23:6-7, where he also broke down the houses of the male shrine prostitutes that were in the temple of the Lord, where women did weaving for Asherah. This passage reveals how deeply Asherah worship had penetrated even into the Jerusalem temple itself. Dagon, the Philistine fish. God of grain and fertility, Dagon was the chief deity of the Philistines, depicted as half man and half fish, representing dominion over both agriculture and the sea. The name Dagon comes from the Hebrew word Dagon, meaning grain, indicating his role as a fertility god responsible for successful harvests and agricultural prosperity. The most famous biblical account involving Dagon occurs in 1 Samuel 5, when the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant and placed it in Dagon's temple in Ashdod. The next morning, they found Dagon's statue fallen face down before the Ark, so they set it back up. The following morning, Dagon had fallen again, but this time his head and hands were broken off, leaving only his fish-like torso. This supernatural humiliation of Dagon demonstrated God's supremacy over Philistine deities and showed that the God of Israel could not be contained or controlled by pagan religious systems. The breaking of Dagon's head and hands symbolically destroyed his ability to think, act, or provide for his worshippers, proving his powerlessness against the true God. Dagon worship involved elaborate festivals celebrating the grain harvest, where Philistines would offer the first fruits of their crops and perform rituals to ensure continued agricultural success. The Philistines attributed their military victories and economic prosperity to Dagon's favor, making his humiliation before the ark particularly devastating to their religious and political confidence. The Golden Calf. Israel's first great apostasy. The golden calf represents Israel's first major act of idolatry, occurring while Moses was receiving the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. According to Exodus 32, the Israelites grew impatient waiting for Moses to return and demanded that Aaron make them gods to go before them, claiming they didn't know what had happened to Moses. Aaron collected gold jewelry from the people and fashioned it into the shape of a calf, then built an altar before it and proclaimed a festival to the Lord. The people offered burnt offerings and peace offerings, then sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play, which included sexual immorality and pagan celebration practices borrowed from Egyptian religion. The calf represented the Egyptian bull god Apis, or the Canaanite fertility deities associated with strength, virility, and agricultural abundance. By creating this idol, the Israelites were attempting to worship God through pagan symbols and practices, combining true religion with false worship methods that God had explicitly forbidden. God's anger burned against the people for this apostasy, and he threatened to destroy them completely and start over with Moses alone. Only Moses' intercession saved the nation, but 3,000 people died when the Levites executed judgment on those who refused to repent. This incident established the principle that God demands exclusive worship without mixture of pagan elements. Chemosh, the Moabite. God demanding human sacrifice. Chemosh was the national deity of Moab, requiring human sacrifice as the ultimate expression of devotion and desperation. The most shocking biblical account of Chemosh worship occurs in 2 Kings 3:27, when the king of Moab sacrificed his own firstborn son as a burnt offering on the city wall during a military siege. This act of child sacrifice was intended to invoke Chemosh's intervention to save Moab from defeat by the combined armies of Israel, Judah, and Edom. The sacrifice apparently had some effect, as the biblical text states that great wrath came upon Israel, and they withdrew from the siege, though this may refer to their horror at witnessing such an abomination rather than Chemosh's actual power. Solomon built a high place for Chemosh on the hill east of Jerusalem, according to 1 Kings 11:7, as part of his accommodation to his foreign wives' religious practices. This compromise led to God's judgment on Solomon's kingdom and contributed to the eventual division of Israel after his death. The worship of Chemosh involved not only human sacrifice but also ritual prostitution and other fertility practices similar to Baal worship. Archaeological evidence from Moabite sites has revealed altars with burn marks and infant remains, confirming the biblical accounts of child sacrifice to this deity. Ashtoreth, the goddess of war and sexual fertility. Ashtoreth, also known as Astarte, was a Canaanite goddess representing both warfare and sexual fertility, demonstrating the ancient connection between violence and reproductive power. She was often depicted as a naked woman holding weapons or standing on a lion, symbolizing her dominion over both love and war. The worship of Ashtoreth involved temple prostitution, where both men and women served as sacred prostitutes, believing that sexual acts performed in her honor would ensure military victory and agricultural fertility. These practices directly violated God's commands regarding sexual purity and exclusive worship, making Ashtoreth worship particularly offensive to biblical morality. Solomon built high places for Ashtoreth, along with other foreign deities to accommodate his many foreign wives, as recorded in 1 Kings 11:5. This compromise introduced systematic idolatry into Israel's religious life and led to God's judgment on Solomon's kingdom, demonstrating how tolerance of false worship inevitably leads to spiritual corruption. The Philistines hung Saul's armor in the temple of Ashtoreth after his death on Mount Gilboa, according to 1 Samuel 31:10, showing how Israel's enemies attributed their military victories to their false gods. This incident illustrates how idolatry not only offends God, but also gives glory to demonic powers that oppose his people. Marduk, the Babylonian king of the gods. Marduk was the chief deity of Babylon, considered the king of all gods and the creator of the world according to Babylonian mythology. The Babylonians believed that Marduk defeated the primordial chaos monster Tiamat and created the world from her corpse, establishing him as the supreme ruler of both gods and humans. The worship of Marduk centered around the massive Ziggurat Tower of Babel and involved elaborate New Year festivals where the Babylonian king would ritually renew his divine mandate to rule. These ceremonies included dramatic reenactments of Marduk's victory over chaos and his establishment of cosmic order through Babylonian imperial power. Daniel's experiences in Babylon directly confronted Marduk worship, particularly when Nebuchadnezzar erected a golden image and demanded universal worship, as recorded in Daniel 3. The three Hebrew young men's refusal to bow down represented a direct challenge to Marduk's supposed supremacy and Babylon's religious authority. The fall of Babylon prophesied in Isaiah 46:1 specifically mentions Marduk, called Merodach, bowing down and being carried away as cargo, symbolizing the complete defeat of Babylonian religion and power. This prophecy was fulfilled when Cyrus the Persian conquered Babylon and allowed the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem, demonstrating God's supremacy over all false gods. Rimmon, the Syrian storm and thunder god. Rimmon was the Syrian storm god worshipped in Damascus, associated with thunder, lightning, and the life-giving rains essential for agriculture in the semi-arid regions of Syria. The name Rimmon means thunderer and reflects his role as the divine controller of weather patterns and seasonal rainfall. The biblical account of Naaman the Syrian in 2 Kings 5 provides insight into Rimmon worship, as Naaman asks Elisha's permission to bow down in Rimmon's temple when accompanying his master, the king of Syria. This request reveals that Rimmon worship involved formal court ceremonies where government officials were expected to participate in state religious functions. Elisha's response, "Go in peace," to Naaman's request has been interpreted various ways, but it demonstrates the complex relationship between political necessity and religious conviction in ancient Near Eastern societies. Naaman's conversion to faith in the God of Israel while maintaining his political obligations illustrates the challenges faced by believers in pagan governmental systems. The worship of Rimmon included seasonal festivals, celebrating the return of the rains, and elaborate rituals designed to ensure continued divine favor for agricultural prosperity. Archaeological evidence from Syrian sites shows altars and temples dedicated to Rimmon, confirming his importance in Syrian religious and political life. Diana of the Ephesians, the Great Mother Goddess. Diana of the Ephesians, known in Greek as Artemis, was one of the most powerful and wealthy goddess cults in the ancient world, centered in the magnificent temple at Ephesus that was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. This goddess represented fertility, hunting, and protection, but her worship involved practices that directly opposed Christian teaching. The Temple of Diana employed thousands of priests, priestesses, and temple prostitutes, generating enormous wealth through religious tourism, sacrificial offerings, and the sale of silver shrines and religious artifacts. The economic impact of Diana worship was so significant that Paul's preaching in Ephesus threatened the livelihood of entire industries built around the goddess cult. Acts 19:23-41 records the riot that erupted when Demetrius the silversmith organized craftsmen against Paul, claiming that his preaching was destroying their business and dishonoring the great goddess Diana. The crowd shouted, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians," for 2 hours, demonstrating the emotional and economic investment people had in this false religious system. The worship of Diana involved fertility rituals, temple prostitution, and elaborate processions where her image was carried through the city. The temple served as both a religious center and a bank, where people deposited money and valuables under the goddess's protection, making it one of the wealthiest institutions in the ancient world. The Queen of Heaven, Babylonian fertility goddess. The Queen of Heaven mentioned in Jeremiah 7:18 and 44:17-25 represents a Babylonian fertility goddess, likely Ishtar or a similar deity, whose worship had infiltrated Jewish religious practices during the exile period. This goddess was associated with fertility, love, war, and the planet Venus, representing the divine feminine principle in Babylonian religion. The worship of the Queen of Heaven involved entire families in coordinated religious activities, as Jeremiah 7:18 describes. The children gather wood, the fathers kindle fire, and the women knead dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven. This family-centered worship made it particularly difficult to eradicate, as it was integrated into daily domestic life. The rituals included burning incense, pouring out drink offerings, and making special cakes shaped like the goddess or marked with her symbols. Women were particularly devoted to this worship because they believed the Queen of Heaven would grant fertility, protect their children, and ensure their family's prosperity and well-being. When Jeremiah confronted the Jewish refugees in Egypt about this idolatry, they defiantly responded that they would continue worshiping the Queen of Heaven because they had prospered when they honored her but suffered calamity when they stopped. This response reveals how people often attribute their circumstances to false gods, rather than recognizing God's discipline for their disobedience. Tammuz, the dying and rising vegetation. God Tammuz was a Mesopotamian deity associated with fertility and vegetation, whose mythological death and resurrection were believed to control the agricultural cycle of planting, growth, harvest, and winter dormancy. The worship of Tammuz involved elaborate mourning rituals during the summer months when vegetation died, followed by celebrations of his resurrection in spring. Ezekiel 8:14 records the prophet's vision of women sitting at the north gate of the temple weeping for Tammuz, showing how this pagan worship had penetrated even into the Jerusalem temple. These mourning rituals involved fasting, wailing, and sexual abstinence as expressions of grief over the god's death and appeals for his return. The Tammuz cult influenced later mystery religions and may have provided a pagan parallel to the death and resurrection of Christ, though the biblical account is historically grounded rather than mythological. The appeal of Tammuz worship lay in its promise of renewed life and fertility through ritual participation in the god's death and resurrection cycle. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamian sites includes numerous figurines and reliefs depicting Tammuz, often shown as a shepherd or in association with vegetation symbols. The widespread nature of this worship explains why it appeared even in Jerusalem, as trade and cultural exchange spread religious practices throughout the ancient Near East. Nisroch, the Assyrian eagle god. Nisroch was an Assyrian deity mentioned in 2 Kings 19:37 and Isaiah 37:38 as the god in whose temple Sennacherib was worshipping when his sons assassinated him. The name Nisroch may derive from Nesher, meaning eagle, suggesting this deity was associated with birds of prey and possibly warfare or royal power. The assassination of Sennacherib while worshipping Nisroch represents divine irony, as the Assyrian king who had blasphemed the God of Israel was killed in the very temple where he sought protection from his false god. This incident demonstrates that pagan deities cannot protect their worshippers from God's judgment or even from ordinary human violence. Assyrian religious practices involved elaborate temple rituals where kings would seek divine guidance for military campaigns and state affairs. The fact that Sennacherib was worshipping when killed suggests he may have been seeking Nisroch's protection or guidance regarding his failed siege of Jerusalem and God's miraculous deliverance of the city. The worship of Nisroch likely involved animal sacrifices, particularly birds, and rituals designed to ensure military victory and royal protection. The irony of Sennacherib's death while seeking such protection emphasizes the powerlessness of false gods to deliver their worshippers from the consequences of opposing the true God. Succoth Benoth, the Babylonian booth goddess. Succoth Benoth was a Babylonian deity worshipped by the people of Babylon who were settled in Samaria after the Assyrian conquest, as recorded in 2 Kings 17:30. The name means booths of daughters, and likely refers to a goddess associated with fertility and prostitution, whose worship involved temporary structures or booths where ritual sexual acts were performed. The worship of Succoth Benoth involved the construction of temporary shelters or booths where sacred prostitution took place as part of fertility rituals. These structures were erected during religious festivals and served as locations where worshippers could engage in sexual acts, believed to ensure agricultural and human fertility. The syncretistic nature of worship in post-exile Samaria created a religious mixture where each ethnic group maintained their traditional deities while nominally acknowledging the God of Israel. This religious compromise led to the spiritual corruption that characterized Samaritan religion and contributed to the ongoing hostility between Jews and Samaritans. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamian sites includes references to similar fertility goddesses and the booth-like structures associated with their worship. The practice of sacred prostitution in temporary structures was common throughout the ancient Near East and represented one of the most morally offensive aspects of pagan religion to biblical standards. Nergal, the Mesopotamian god of war and plague. Nergal was a Mesopotamian deity associated with war, plague, and the underworld, worshipped by the men of Cuth, who were settled in Samaria, according to 2 Kings 17:30. This god was believed to control disease, death, and military conflict, making him both feared and revered by ancient peoples who sought his protection from the very disasters he was thought to cause. The worship of Nergal involved rituals designed to appease his wrath and prevent plague, famine, and military defeat. These ceremonies often included animal sacrifices, particularly of animals associated with death and decay, and rituals performed in underground chambers or caves representing his dominion over the underworld. Nergal was typically depicted as a warrior carrying weapons and sometimes shown with the head of a lion, symbolizing his fierce and destructive nature. The dual aspect of this deity as both the cause and potential preventer of disaster reflects the ancient understanding of divine power as fundamentally unpredictable and dangerous. The introduction of Nergal worship into Samaria contributed to the religious syncretism that characterized the region after the Assyrian conquest. The combination of various pagan deities with nominal acknowledgement of the God of Israel created a corrupted religious system that satisfied neither true worship nor effective paganism. Adramelech and Anamelech, the Sepharvite fire gods. Adramelech and Anamelech were deities worshipped by the people of Sepharvaim who were settled in Samaria, as mentioned in 2 Kings 17:31. These gods required child sacrifice by fire, with worshippers burning their children alive as offerings to ensure divine favor and protection from disaster. The names of these deities suggest connections to royal power and divine authority, with Adramelech possibly meaning Adar is king, and Anamelech meaning Anu is king, referring to Mesopotamian divine rulers. The requirement for child sacrifice made these among the most morally abhorrent deities mentioned in Scripture. The practice of burning children to these gods involved heating bronze statues until they glowed red hot, then placing living infants and young children in the outstretched arms of the images. The screams of the victims were drowned out by loud music and drumming, creating horrific scenes that God repeatedly condemned throughout the Old Testament. The introduction of these fire gods into Samaria brought some of the most extreme forms of pagan worship into the land that God had given to Israel. The tolerance of such practices demonstrates how far the religious corruption had progressed and why God's judgment on the northern kingdom was both necessary and just. The brazen serpent, when good symbols become idols. The brazen serpent represents a unique case of how even God-ordained symbols can become objects of false worship when people lose sight of their original purpose. Originally created by Moses in Numbers 21:8-9 as a means of healing for those bitten by poisonous serpents, the bronze snake became an object of worship that required destruction during Hezekiah's reforms. According to 2 Kings 18:4, the Israelites had been burning incense to the bronze serpent for centuries, treating it as a deity capable of providing healing and protection. Hezekiah called it Nehushtan, meaning piece of bronze, to emphasize its material nature and lack of divine power before breaking it into pieces. The transformation of the bronze serpent from a symbol of God's healing power into an object of worship illustrates how religious symbols can become idols when people focus on the physical object rather than the God it represents. This principle applies to any religious artifact or symbol that becomes an end in itself rather than a means of worshiping God. The worship of the bronze serpent involved burning incense and possibly other offerings, treating it as a source of healing power independent of God's will. This practice violated the fundamental principle that worship belongs to God alone and that no created object, regardless of its original sacred purpose, should receive divine honor.